The young man had the old man's ruined hand held up in the sunlight, and the whole crowd was laughing. "Look at them slow old hands, folks," he crowed, gripping the scarred wrist so everyone could see the bent fingers, the shining knuckles. The whole hand curled a little inward, like something that had been through fire and never fully come back. This fella couldn't draw a picture, let alone a pistol. It was August of 1957, at the Platte County Fair outside Chugwater, Wyoming, and the old man being laughed at said nothing. He just lowered his eyes and waited for it to pass, the way a man waits out weather he can't do anything about. But here is what that crowd did not know. Those slow, ruined hands had once been the fastest in the West. That old man had filled tents. Men had traveled 100 miles just to watch him draw a pistol. Children had begged their fathers for the money to see him. And the very thing that had wrecked his hand, the thing the young man was holding up for everyone to laugh at, was the single bravest thing anyone in that county had ever done. There was one person at that fair who knew all of it. A tall man, standing at the back of the crowd, hat pulled low, arms folded across his chest. He had not come to the Platte County Fair by accident. He had come a long way, on purpose, to find this exact old man, and he knew something about that ruined hand that not one other soul in Chugwater did. In a few minutes, that tall stranger will step out of the crowd and take a single shot that stops every laugh at this fair cold. He will tell a story about a fire in the winter of 1931 that will make the cocky young man go white to the lips. And 59 years from now, a sealed letter opened in a small county museum will finally answer the question the whole crowd is about to ask out loud. Who was he? Nobody at that fair recognizes him yet. By the end of this story, you will never look at a pair of slow old hands the same way again. Here is the story. His name was Amos Kell, and he was 68 years old, and he had come to the fair the way he came every single year, quietly, in a clean-pressed shirt, alone, to watch. He asked nothing of anybody. He stood at the back and let the young people have the front, and he was content, most years, to be a face in the crowd that nobody looked at twice. He was born in the spring of 1889 in a sod house on the Nebraska line, the fourth of 7 children in a family that had almost nothing but hard winters and a father with a temper and a bottle that made the winters harder. There was never enough food, never enough coal, never enough of whatever it was a boy needs to feel like he matters. But Amos Kell had one thing, and it was entirely his own, and no drunk father and no hard winter could take it from him. He had an eye. He could throw a stone and hit a fence post at 40 paces. He could knock a tin can off a rail with a slingshot in the dark, by the sound of it, when he couldn't rightly see it. It was the one thing in the whole world that belonged to him, and he held onto it the way a drowning man holds a rope, because in a certain sense, that is exactly what it was. He got his first pistol at 14, an old single-action revolver a departing neighbor left behind, more rust than shine, and from that day forward, Amos Kell did one thing better than any man then living. He practiced. Not in the heat of a crowd, not for show, not for anyone's applause, alone. On cold mornings, before another living soul in the county was awake, when his breath hung white in the air and his fingers ached with the cold. He would work the same simple draw 1,000 times in a row, slow, then slower still, chasing some small flaw in the motion that only he could feel, a flaw so fine that no watching eye could ever have caught it. That was the secret nobody understood, and it was the secret that mattered most. The world thought the marvel was speed. Amos knew the truth. Speed was only what patience looked like after 10,000 mornings. The fast hand everyone gasped at was just the shadow the slow mornings cast. He never could get people to understand that, and after a while he stopped trying. By the middle 1920s he was famous, genuinely, widely famous, in the way a man could be famous then. He traveled first with a Wild West show and later on his own, and in every town the posters went up ahead of him, in red and black letters 2 feet tall. Kell, the fastest hand in the West. See it with your own eyes. And people came. They filled tents. They stood 6 deep in the summer heat. They brought their children and lifted them onto their shoulders so the little ones could see. He had a signature trick, the one that stopped every crowd cold and sent them home talking. He would take a silver coin in each hand and toss them both up into the air at the same moment, one from the left, one from the right. And somehow, in the space of time it took those 2 coins to reach the top of their arc and start falling, Amos Kell would draw his pistol and holster it again, smooth and unhurried, and then catch both coins coming down, left, then right, without ever once appearing to rush. Grown men swore it couldn't be done. They watched him do it twice a night, 6 nights a week, and still swore it. It looked like magic. It was not magic. It was the mornings. It was always the mornings. There was one person in the world who understood that about him completely, and her name was Sarah. Amos married her in the autumn of 1919, and she traveled the good years of the show with him, and she saw him the way the crowds never could. She saw the cold mornings. She saw the 10,000 slow repetitions with no one watching. She used to sit with the young men who came around wanting Amos to teach them the fast draw, and she'd tell them the same thing every time, and it always disappointed them. The gift got him to the door, Sarah would say, but it was the mornings that got him through it. Don't you ever mistake the one for the other. Any fool can be born quick. It takes a real man to get up in the cold 10,000 times when nobody's watching and nobody ever will. She had a laugh that could fill a tent all on its own. Amos Kell lost her to a long, slow illness in the winter of 1948, and after that something in him went quiet and never once got loud again. He kept her photograph in his breast pocket every day of his life, over his heart, and if you'd known to look, you'd have seen the outline of it worn into the cloth of every shirt he owned. But the fame was already gone by the time Sarah went. And that is the part of the story that matters most, because his fame had not faded the slow, ordinary way that fame usually fades, with age, with newer names, with the slow turning of the world's attention to younger men. Amos Kell's fame had been taken from him, all at once, in a single night, in a fire, in the bitter winter of 1931. We will come to that fire. It matters that we come to it in exactly the right place in this story, because the whole thing turns on it, and if I tell it too soon, it won't land the way it has to land. So for now, hold on to only this. The man being laughed at in front of that crowd had once been so good, so genuinely and completely good at the one thing he did, that other men measured themselves against him and came up short and knew it. He had signed his name for children who were grandparents now. He had been, for one bright stretch of years, exactly the kind of man that very crowd would have paid good money and travelled hard miles to see. They simply did not know it. And Amos Kell was too proud, or too tired, or too gentle to be the one to tell them. He was, in all the quiet ways a small town keeps its accounts, a good man. He was the one who mended the widow Harmon's fence after her husband passed, and never once mentioned having done it. He was the one who taught half the boys in the county how to sit a horse and hold a rifle safe. He never bragged about a single thing in his life. He'd have told you, if you'd pushed him, that bragging was for men who hadn't done enough yet to let the work speak for itself. He just never got the chance to say any of that to the boy who was laughing at his hand. The boy's name was Dale Rourke, and he was 23 years old, and he was fast. There was no getting around that part. He was genuinely, naturally fast. Everybody in Platte County said so, and Dale made very sure they kept on saying it. He was lean as a fence post, with a low-slung holster he'd oiled until it gleamed, and a grin he wore like it cost him nothing at all. He had already beaten the fair's quick-draw timer 3 separate times that afternoon, and each time he'd turned to the gathered crowd and spread his arms wide, like a man standing on a stage waiting for the applause he was sure he'd earned. And each time, the crowd gave it to him. But here is a thing that is true about crowds, and Dale Rourke understood it in his bones the way some young men understand exactly the wrong things. A crowd that has laughed once wants very badly to laugh again. The first laugh is free. After that, the crowd starts to hunger, and it will follow whoever promises to feed it. So Dale went looking for something to feed them. And at the back of the crowd, quiet and clean-shirted and asking nothing of anybody, he found an old man with a ruined hand. Now, it would be easy to make Dale Rourke into a monster, but that would be a lie, and it would miss the whole point of what happened that day. Dale wasn't a monster. He was something far more ordinary than a monster, and in a way, something worse. He was the entire country in the summer of 1957, in a terrible hurry, quietly deciding that old was just another word for useless. He was the sound a whole nation makes when it stops listening to the very people who built the thing it's standing on. Dale Rourke just happened to be saying that sound out loud, at a county fair, with a grin on his face. Most people had the decency to only think it. "Say there, old-timer," Dale called out, loud enough to turn every head nearby. "You ever handle a gun? Back in the covered wagon days?" A few people chuckled. Amos Kell said nothing at all. He had learned, over a long life, that the surest way in the world to make a young fool louder was to answer him. "Oh, come on now, don't be shy," Dale said, and he walked toward the old man, playing to the crowd with every step. "Let's see them famous fast hands. I bet a man your age was really something, back in the day." And then he reached out, quick as a striking snake, and took Amos Kell by the wrist, the ruined right wrist, and lifted that scarred hand up high into the August sunlight for the whole crowd to see and laugh at. "Well, would you look at that?" Dale crowed. "Look at them slow old hands, folks. This fella couldn't draw a picture, let alone a pistol." And he mimed a slow, fumbling, useless draw. His tongue stuck out between his teeth like a man doing hard arithmetic, and the crowd roared. Amos Kell pulled his hand back, gently, and lowered his eyes, and said nothing. Near the front of that crowd, a woman in her early 30s stood holding a small boy by the hand. Her name was Ruth, and she had come to the fair for the pies and the ribbons, and to give her boy a good day, and she had no idea she was standing at the exact center of the most important afternoon of her life. She did not know the old man. She had no way to know him. But watching him be made small in front of everyone, something in her chest turned over and hurt in a way she could not have explained to you if you'd asked. She wanted to say something. She wanted to step forward and tell that grinning boy to stop. She didn't. She stayed silent and held her son's hand and looked at the ground, and the moment passed. And she would carry the shame of that silence for years afterward, turning it over in the dark, wishing she had been braver. What Ruth could not possibly have known, standing there ashamed of herself in that crowd, was that she had just been handed a second chance, a rare and precious thing that most people never get, and that the tall man at the back of the crowd was about to be the one to hand it to her. Because that is the thing that makes what came next land so hard. The crowd thought they were watching a slow old man get what slow old men get. Ruth felt something she couldn't name and hated herself for not acting on it. And a tall stranger, hat pulled low over his eyes, had been standing very still at the back of it all, watching every second of it, and had finally, quietly, decided that he had seen enough. Before we go on, because what happens next is truly the whole beating heart of this story, and I don't want you to miss a second of it, let me stop and ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone get laughed at for being old, for being slow, for being past whatever it is the world has decided counts as useful? Have you ever stood in a crowd exactly like that one and felt something turn over hard in your chest and known in your gut that it was wrong, and then said nothing at all, the very same way Ruth said nothing? Most of us have. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us have stood in that crowd more than once, and most of us have carried the regret of it, quiet, for a long time afterward. If you believe, deep down, that we have forgotten how to honor the people who came before us, the ones who built the roads and fought the wars and got up in the cold 10,000 mornings so we wouldn't have to, then do me one small favor right now. Type a single word down in the comments. Just this: respect. I read every one of them, and I want to know you're out there. And if this story is starting to mean something to you, share it with someone who taught you patience, a parent, a grandparent, an old teacher, anyone whose slow and steady hands built something in your life that lasted. Now, let's go back to Chugwater, Wyoming, and the tall man finally stepping out of that crowd. He was a big man. That was the very first thing anyone noticed about him, and it was the thing they'd all agree on later. Broad through the shoulders, tall enough that he had to tip his head down to look Dale Rourke in the eye, and he moved the way certain big men move when they have long since stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. Slow, unhurried, taking up exactly the room he needed and not 1 inch more. And he tried words first. That part matters. "Son," he said, and his voice came out low and even and carrying from somewhere deep in that broad chest. "That's about enough now. You don't know who you're talking to. Do yourself a favor and let it go." It was the wrong move, and the tall man knew it was the wrong move the very second the words left his mouth. Because a boy who is playing to a crowd cannot back down in front of that crowd, not without losing every bit of the standing he came there to win. Backing down would cost Dale Rourke the whole afternoon. So Dale did the only thing a cornered young fool ever knows how to do. He got louder. "Who are you supposed to be? His nurse? Dale sneered, and the crowd laughed, and Dale fed on it. He turned right back to the old man and grabbed that ruined hand and hauled it up into the air again, higher this time, and cracked another joke about covered wagons and horse and buggy days, and the laugh that came back was bigger than any of the ones before it. Reason had failed. Worse than failed, it had made everything worse. The old man's shame was doubled now, out in front of an even bigger crowd, and in a hard way it was the tall man's own fault for having tried the gentle path first. So the tall man stopped trying the gentle path. He walked, slow and easy, to the quick-draw booth at the edge of the gallery. He reached down and picked up the fair's own display pistol off the counter, and he checked it over the way a man checks a tool he has held 10,000 times in his life. Easy, familiar, his hands knowing the weight and the balance of it without his eyes seeming to bother. "You're fast," he said to Dale, not unkindly. "I'll give you that, and I'll give it to you honest. Fastest hands at this whole fair, I'd wager. But fast and good are not the same animal, son. They never have been, and they never will be. You want me to show you the difference between the two?" "You gonna outdraw me?" Dale said, and now, for the first time all afternoon, some of the swagger had thinned right out of his voice. "No," the tall man said quietly. "I am not going to draw against you, or against any man. That is exactly how good people end up hurt or dead, and there is not one single thing at a county fair worth a bullet. What I am going to do is show you what an old master's hands can still do, even ruined, that yours cannot do yet, no matter how fast you are. And I'm going to do it for you in one shot." He turned and found the fair banner, the long painted cloth strung high between two poles above the shooting gallery. Platte County Fair, 1957, in bright bold letters, held up at one far corner by a single length of cord, no thicker than a bootlace, snapping and jerking in the hot prairie wind, maybe 60 feet off the ground. He could have outdrawn the boy. He could have shamed him right back, word for cruel word, until the crowd was laughing at Dale instead. He could have simply turned around and walked away, and let the whole ugly thing go, and told himself it was none of his business. He did none of those three things. Because the easy thing, in that moment, was the invisible thing, the thing nobody would remember by supper, and the invisible thing would not have taught that boy one single lesson worth the learning. So he took his time. That was the thing the whole crowd remembered for years afterward, the thing they told and retold at kitchen tables and on porches all across that county. He did not hurry. He did not flash. He stood square to the banner. He breathed out, slow and long. He let the wind tell him what the wind was doing, reading the snap and jerk of that far corner. And Dale Rourke, who had been fast his entire short life and had made the whole afternoon's mistake of confusing fast with good, watched the tall man take his time and felt, for the very first time that day, a small, cold understanding settle into his stomach that he had badly misjudged this entire afternoon and everyone in it. The tall man raised the pistol, one single motion, smooth as water pouring, and he fired. The cord parted clean, 60 feet up. The banner dropped, folding and rippling down through the bright air, and the whole crowd made one single low sound together, a held breath let go all at once, as Platte County Fair, 1957, came sailing gently down and settled over the shooting gallery like a curtain falling at the end of the last act of a play. For one long moment, not one person in that crowd said a single word. Then the tall man leaned down and set the pistol carefully back on the counter, and he turned, not to Dale Rourke, not to the crowd, but to the old man at the back with the ruined hand. "Mr. Kell," he said, and the name went through that crowd like a current through water, because how in the world did this tall stranger know the old man's name? "There's a young fella standing here," the tall man went on, "who doesn't have the first idea who he's been talking to, and I believe it is about time that somebody finally told him." Now, you might be sitting there wondering why the tall man wouldn't just outdraw Dale Rourke and have done with it. It certainly would have been simpler. It would have been quicker, and the crowd, hungry as it was, would have absolutely loved it. So why not just beat the boy at his own game? Because that was never, for 1 second, the point. And the tall man understood that better than anyone else on that fairground. If he had outdrawn the boy, if he had simply been faster and shamed Dale with pure speed, he would have taught that young man the single worst lesson there is to learn in this life. He would have taught him that the answer to a fast gun is only ever a faster gun. that the way you beat a bully is by becoming a bigger and meaner bully than he is. And Dale Rourke would have licked his wounds and gone home stewing and practiced twice as hard in the cold. And in 10 years' time, he'd have been the exact same man he was that afternoon, only meaner and quicker and harder to teach. So the tall man did the one thing that a boy simply cannot answer with speed. He showed him precision. He showed him patience. He showed him the single shot that actually mattered, taken slow, taken right, taken when 100 fast and flashy shots would have meant absolutely nothing at all. He showed Dale Rourke, plain as daylight, that the old man he'd spent his afternoon mocking lived in an entire world that Dale didn't even know existed yet. A quiet, patient, hard-won world where the hand was never once the marvel. You cannot beat that with a fast draw. There is no beating it. You can only learn it, slow, the hard way, over years. And the learning of it always starts in the very same place, with being humbled, gently, in front of every single person you were just so busy showing off to. That is why the tall man would not draw. He had not come to that fair to win anything. He had come to change a boy's whole idea of what a man actually is. And he was not finished yet. The tall man told it plain, without any drama at all, standing there in the slowly settling dust, while the whole crowd leaned in close to hear. Winter of 1931, he began. A grain elevator caught fire out on the edge of a little town, not far at all from where we're standing right now. It was the dead middle of the night, and it was cold. Cold enough that night to crack stone, cold enough to freeze the water in the fire buckets solid. And there was a family living up in the rooms above the elevator office. A man, his wife, and 2 little girls. The fire came up the only staircase and cut them off from the ground. And by the time anybody in that town got there to help, the entire lower floor was already one solid wall of flame. He paused. He looked over at Amos Kell, and Amos Kell was looking hard at the ground. Now, there was a famous man living in that town back in those days, the tall man went on. The fastest hands in 3 whole states. He filled tents, he signed his name for children, and he was there that night, in the crowd of helpless folks standing out in the snow, watching that building burn, the same as everybody else was, except that he did not stay in the crowd. He went in. He took his own coat off his back and threw it over his head, and he went straight up that burning staircase into the fire, and he carried those 2 little girls out, one tucked under each arm. Then he turned right around, and he went back into it a second time for their mother. And then, because the father had gone down from the smoke and wasn't coming out on his own, he went back into that fire a 3rd time. The whole fair had gone completely, perfectly silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He got every one of them out, the tall man said. All 4. Every single soul in that building lived, because of him. And the last time he came back out through that burning doorway, carrying the father, a beam came down out of the ceiling across his right hand and pinned it flat against the frame. And he tore it loose because there was nothing else on God's earth he could do. And he carried that man clear of the fire with a hand that would never, ever be the same again. He looked straight at Dale Rourke now, and his voice did not rise even a little, because it did not need to. And that, the tall man said, that slow, ruined, curled-up old hand that you were holding up in the sunlight and laughing at not 15 minutes ago, that was the fastest hand in the West. It gave up being fast so that 4 people could go on being alive. And in 26 years since that night, it has never once complained about the trade. Dale Rourke's face had gone white, bone white and slack. He looked at the old man, and then he said the thing that finally broke him wide open, said it low, mostly to himself, but in that dead silence, every single person standing there heard every word of it. "I thought fast was the whole thing," Dale said, and his voice cracked right down the middle. "I thought fast was... I didn't even know there was anything else." And there it was. That was the comfortable lie of Dale Rourke's entire young life, spoken out loud at last, and dying in his own mouth in the very same breath that he spoke it. There was something else. There had always been something else. And he had spent the whole golden afternoon laughing at the finest living example of it in the entire state of Wyoming. The crowd was murmuring now, low and ashamed, the way a crowd murmurs when it has all just realized together exactly what it took part in. But near the front, the woman named Ruth had gone completely, utterly still. Her small boy was tugging at her hand, asking her something, and she did not feel it, and did not hear him. because Ruth had done the arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic had stopped her heart. The winter of 1931, a grain elevator on the edge of a small town, 2 little girls carried out of the fire, one under each arm of a man whose face she had never been able to remember and had never once stopped trying to. She had been one of those 2 little girls. She let go of her son's hand, and she stepped forward, slow, moving like a woman walking through the middle of a dream, and she crossed the open ground and stopped directly in front of Amos Kell, and she looked up into his weathered old face. "It was you," she said. It was barely more than a whisper. "It was you." And Amos Kell, who in 26 long years had never once mentioned that night to a single living soul, not to Sarah, not to anyone, who had carried the whole thing folded up, silent inside himself all that time, Amos Kell looked down at the grown woman standing in front of him, and he saw, underneath all the years, the small, terrified little girl he had carried down a burning staircase into the snow. And his ruined right hand came slowly up and covered his mouth. And this proud, quiet, gentle, forgotten old man began, at long last, to weep. Ruth had never known his name. Her family had packed up and moved clear away that following spring, chasing work, and the man who had walked into fire 3 times to save all their lives had simply vanished back into the smoke of that night and out of their lives forever. For 26 years she had carried the memory of being carried, and no name to put to it, and no way on earth to say thank you. And not one single hour ago she had stood in this very crowd, a grown woman now, and said absolutely nothing at all, while a grinning boy made that same man small. She got her second chance. Most people, in this life, never do. She threw both her arms around a stranger who was not a stranger at all, and she said thank you into his shoulder, 26 years too late, and somehow, at the very same time, right exactly on time. And the tall man simply stood back, quiet, and let the 2 of them have that moment whole and unbroken. And Dale Rourke stood off to the side, with his fast, useless, empty hands hanging down at his sides, learning at last, at 23 years old, the difference between a man who knows how to draw a crowd's attention and a man who has actually earned the right to it. It changed the boy. That is always the part folks most want to know about, in the end. And the good and honest news is that it is completely true. It changed him all the way down to the root. Dale Rourke came out to Amos Kell's place the very next morning, on foot, with his hat literally held in both his hands, and he asked the old man if he would teach him. Not the fast draw, not that, never that again. The other thing. The mornings. And Amos Kell, who had every right under heaven to send that boy packing back down the road, looked at him for a long, long moment on that porch, and then he stepped back from the door and he said, "Well, come on in out of the cold then, coffee's hot." Because that, underneath everything, was simply who Amos Kell had always been. Dale learned patience from that old man for the next 11 years, right up until Amos passed quietly in his sleep in the autumn of 1968. And Dale Rourke never once, for the entire rest of his long life, mocked an old person again. Not ever, not once, not for any reason. And when Dale himself finally grew old, he made a habit of telling the story to any young man who would sit still long enough to hear it, and he always, without fail, ended it in the exact same way. "The fastest hands I ever saw in my whole life," Dale would say, "belonged to a man that everybody in the county thought was slow. So don't you go and make the mistake I made. Don't you ever, ever measure the worth of a person by the speed of their hands." And Ruth, the woman from the crowd, the little girl from the fire, she and Amos Kell wrote letters back and forth to each other faithfully, every single month, right up until the very end of the old man's life. And her granddaughter, a bright girl named Joni, grew up on those letters, grew up on the whole story of the slow old man with the fastest hands in the West, and the fire, and the 3 trips up the burning stairs. Joni took up shooting herself as a girl, not for the show of it, never for the show, but purely for the patience the thing demanded. And she was good. She was better than good. Joni went on, in time, to become an Olympic shooting coach, and she spent her whole career teaching a rising generation of young athletes the exact same hard truth that Amos Kell had spent 11 years teaching Dale Rourke on cold Wyoming mornings. That the marvel is never, ever the hand. It is the mornings. It has always been the mornings. Amos Kell's worn, old single-action revolver, his tarnished exhibition medal from the show years, and one sealed letter now sit together in a glass case in the small county museum in Platte County, Wyoming. And it was that one sealed letter, unopened for decades, that at long last answered the single question the entire crowd had been left asking on that hot August afternoon in 1957. Who was the tall man? The letter was finally opened in the year 2016, 59 years, almost to the season, after that day at the Platte County Fair, when the last of the family at last gave the little museum their permission to unseal it and put its contents on display for the public to read. It was written out in a plain, strong, careful hand, and it explained, quietly, every last thing. The tall man, the letter said, had personally known one of the people that Amos Kell carried out of that burning building. He had heard the whole story of that night, years and years after the fact, told to him by the grown son of the very father that Amos had gone back into the fire a third time to save. And the story had never once left him. It had stayed lodged in him, all those years, the almost unbearable idea of a man who had willingly given up the one single thing that made him famous and beloved across 3 whole states, and had then quietly let the entire world forget all about him for it, and had never breathed one word about any of it to anyone, ever. So, when the tall man happened to be passing through the state of Wyoming in the summer of 1957, and heard by chance that the old marksman was still living, and still came out every single year just to quietly watch the Chugwater Fair, he went. He did not go to perform. He did not go to be seen. He went to find the man, and to shake his ruined hand, and to say a thank you of his own. And when he arrived, and found that good old man being laughed at by a boy in front of a crowd, he did the only thing that a genuinely decent person could ever do. The letter was signed at the bottom with the name written on the man's own birth certificate, the name from before the whole world came to know him by an entirely different one. Marion Robert Morrison. The tall man at the Platte County Fair, all those years, had been John Wayne. He had asked in the letter that none of it ever be told while he was still living. He had not done any of it to be seen doing it, or thanked for it, or praised. He had done it for the simplest and oldest reason there is, because a great and good man had been made small in front of a laughing crowd, and John Wayne could not stand, could never in his life stand, to watch a good man be made small. Today, the glass case in that little Platte County museum still holds the 3 things, side by side: the worn revolver, the tarnished medal, and the plain, unsealed letter. The small brass plaque fixed beneath the case names Amos Kell and tells the story of the fire and the 4 lives and the ruined hand. It does not name the man who took the shot. So the next time you happen to see someone that the world has already quietly decided is too old, or too slow, or too far past whatever it counts as useful, the very next time you feel the pull to laugh, even a little, at a pair of slow old hands, I want you to remember Amos Kell. Remember what those slow, ruined hands did on a freezing winter night in 1931. Remember the 3 trips up the burning stairs, and remember, above all, that the marvel was never once the speed. It was the mornings. It was always, always the mornings. They don't make men like John Wayne anymore. If this story moved you the way it moved me, type that one word, respect, down in the comments below. Share it with someone who taught you patience, and subscribe and stay with us for more true-hearted stories from a time when a man's real worth was measured slowly and honestly and right.